I want to hopefully finish up with Tatian's Diatessaron to begin with this evening. It won't put us all the way through yet with Syriac studies. We'll have full 2 or 3 or 4 more messages to go on the Peshitta, the Philoxenian, the Harclean, the Palestinian, and George Lambsa's versions, but we'll get to that later. We were looking last time with Tatian's Diatessaron at manuscript evidence, basically. 2 chief things that we've seen thus far concerning manuscript evidence with Tatian's Diatessaron. One thing to remember before I say that is the fact that we do not have Tatian's Diatessaron extant any longer, neither in Syriac nor in Greek. So that presents a little bit of a problem as far as some people are concerned. Really, as far as any of us are concerned, it would present a little bit of a problem without having it extant. And so, of course, we have to ask then ourselves the question, how do we know it ever really existed? We're going to get later into the fact that critical scholarship in past centuries has denied the historicity of Tatian's Diatessaron, and why they did that we'll explain momentarily. But we do have several good lines of evidence now available to us. Number 1, we saw Ephraim's commentary. Ephraim was a Syrian church writer, probably the most important Syrian churchman that ever lived as far as ecclesiastical writings are concerned. He died around 373 A.D., probably writing his commentary somewhere around 350. What is significant about that is simply the fact that Tatian's Diatessaron must have been held in high esteem by Ephraim, or why would you be writing a commentary on someone else's commentary? Basically, it's what it is. Tatian's Diatessaron is a harmony of the Gospels, but it is a commentary in the sense that he has to pick and choose what he wants to include and what he doesn't want to. Therefore, it's a man's exposition or interpretation or commentary on the Gospels. And then to have Ephraim come along and, as it were, write a commentary on a commentary instead of a commentary on the Bible. You know, most commentaries are written on biblical books, but to write a commentary on a commentary would show the significance of that. Well, of course, we ran into a problem with Ephraim's Syriac commentary. It passed off the scene as well, until fairly recent times. Now we have in the Syriac as much as maybe 3/5 come to light in the late 1950s of Ephraim's Syriac commentary, which is extremely important because it preserves the kernel and the germ of many, many comments, not all, but many, many comments of Tatian in his Diatessaron on the 4 canonical Gospels. And then secondly, another line of current evidence would be the recent discovery, 1921, the discovery of the area, and then 33, the publication by Yale University of a little small 4-inch by 4-inch fragment in Greek that it was found at Dura on the Euphrates that dates back to somewhere like 256 A.D., which means this little fragment can't be more than a century, not more than 86 years, but to be general, not more than a century beyond the date of the autograph. Then that gives us a question of the original language of composition for Tatian's Diatessaron. Was that Syriac? Was that Greek? As Professor F.C. Burkitt said, was that Latin? We don't think the latter of those. Probably not the first of those. Perhaps the middle of those, that it was written in Greek and by someone, either Tatian himself or someone else, later translated into Syriac. That's hypothetical, I will admit, and be sure you realize that's hypothetical. No one can prove the original language of Tatian. But we had 2 points of evidence that seemed to cause us to lean in that direction. One, and very important, would be the earliest fragment we have of the Diatessaron is a Greek fragment from 256 or sometime earlier. And then secondly, the very name of the writing, Diatessaron, comes from a Greek musical term meaning a harmony of 4. Literally, Diatessaron means through the 4 Gospels we see. So we've got 2 good lines of evidence pointing toward the Diatessaron: Ephraim's commentary, now largely extant in Syriac, and this small, minor 4-inch by 4-inch fragment of a Greek manuscript. This evening then, in wrapping things up, I want to look first of all at the composition of Tatian's Diatessaron. Then I want to look at source material for his Diatessaron, his sources. And then thirdly, and I guess most importantly, why spend 2 weeks, 2 evenings on this, the significance of Tatian's Diatessaron. What is the significance of all of this material we've been looking at concerning Tatian's Diatessaron? Okay, let's begin first of all with composition, the composition. Here we're asking the question then, how did Tatian go about composing a harmony? And for this we want to practice ourselves a little exercise. Matthew 19, Mark 10, Luke 18. You'll have to keep your finger in all portions of that. We'll practice ourselves in a little harmonistic fashion here of a couple of sentences in the Gospels. Making a harmony of the Gospels is not the easiest task. It's been popular through church history, but it is not the easiest thing to do. It will not take very much at all before you have a mass of confusion on your hands, either in duplication or omission. Obviously, that would be the two areas where we would fall into problems when we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're trying to harmonize all of this. In days before the computers, and we're going to practice without computers, it doesn't take much at all. Just a little slip here or there, and you're going to have a massive confusion on your hands, either in duplicating material. You got it over here in Matthew, and then you forgot that you got it from Matthew, and you put it in there again from Luke. And then something that you just were certain that you took out of Matthew and you put there, by the time you got to Mark, you thought it's not necessary to put that sentence there because I got that from Matthew. Then by the time you get to Luke, you think, well, I got it not from Mark, but from Matthew. By the time you get to John, you think, I didn't get it from Luke or Mark, but I got it from Matthew. And so it's down there. And then you go back and find out you have omitted something entirely. Mark 10, 25, and 26. And Luke 18, the same verses, 25 and 26, just happens to work out that way. With Matthew 19, a verse earlier, 24 and 25. Now, I have the benefit of having it all before me in parallel columns here. You don't have the benefit. You have to go from one manuscript, as it were, to another. It's too bad it's bound in a codex form here, because it's a little difficult. You have to keep at least 3 fingers in 3 portions of Scripture. Now, I didn't pick this out to drop any hints or preach a message or anything about camels or needles or disciples being exceedingly amazed. Just one that I happened to open to in Robertson's Harmony on the Gospels. Of course, I couldn't use Robertson since he uses RSV version, and most of us aren't using that here. So we'll stay with the KJV since we're still using that for a while anyway here in the church. You'll need to look at Matthew 19, 24 to 25. Kind of read over the verses, see what we're talking about there. And see, we're wanting to make our harmony. And we're just going to do 2 verses. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of verses trying to harmonize these things in the Gospels. Then you'll want to look at Mark 10, 25 and 26. Starts there. It is easier. Goes on, they were astonished out of measure, saying among themselves, who then can be saved? With Luke 18, verses 25 and 26. We're asking ourselves, how did Tatian do this? Okay, now you're going to tell me what to write. That's how we're going to play this little game here. You're going to tell me what I'm supposed to write. Now, do you understand what we're doing? We're going to try to harmonize this material. We don't want to omit something, but we don't want to duplicate something either. We want to end up with something that is smooth, harmonious, that goes together well, that reads well as well. Okay, flipping back and forth, someone start me off. What am I supposed to say here? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. See, we're kind of glad that Matthew stuck with himself and the other 2 with themselves, but Tatian wants to get it together. And there is a benefit of having it all together. Not run in narrative form, of course, as we've described, as Tatian did. A synopsis is much better where you have columns that parallel one another. What's the first word? And again? Where are you getting that from? Okay, what does Mark say? Oh, so that comes later. We can skip Mark. What about Luke? 4. Oh, we got the word for there. Okay, what about if we say, I'm going to be writing this down so I see what it looks like by the time we get through and see if you pass the test here. Okay, we're going to say Matthew then. And again, I say unto you. And again, I say unto you. For, okay, we got that from Luke. I'm going to be marking Matthew, Luke, Mark as we move along here. And again, I say unto you, for it is easier for nobody has a jerboa or something in there, for a camel to go through. Now what? Someone said the needle's eye, and someone said the eye of a needle. Which one? You see what we're running into there? Luke is a little bit different. Through a needle's eye. 2 out of 3, all right? So that just means Luke must not have been inspired that morning he wrote his gospel then. He missed it. He wasn't agreeing. Well, see, this is a whole problem with harmonies right here. Why would Luke have it said in that manner? In other words, this is what good scholarship of the Gospels will do. Of course, critical scholarship will do it in the wrong sense. You try to get behind the authors here and find out what's going on. How can we have 2 of them saying, through the eye of a needle? And Luke says, through a needle's eye. In other words, did Jesus say both of those things the time he said this? Did he say through the eye of a needle and then through a needle's eye? Or did he just say one of them? And if he just said one of them, well, KJV has both of them, though. Has one through the eye of a needle over in Matthew, Mark, and then it has through a needle's eye over in Luke. If he just said one of those, and does that mean that the other authors, either Luke or maybe he was right and Matthew and Mark are wrong? That they're not inspired then? So he couldn't have said both of those, I don't guess. Maybe some of you think that he could. Did he say through a needle's eye and through the eye of a needle? Okay, so you want to go with majority. That's good popular American thinking there. You want to go with majority. Through the eye of a needle. So Luke missed it that morning. We'll just mark that out. Through the eye of a needle, where do we go from there? Than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. Does that all look the same in all 3? So we'll just kind of leave that as such. Okay, next verse now. And, someone says, and they, his disciples, and they, comma, his disciples, comma, okay, you want that, heard it, and they, his disciples, that heard it, were astonished out, were exceedingly, someone says, were exceedingly amazed and out of measure, or exceedingly astonished out of measure and amazed. We took exceedingly away from amazed, though. Well, and amazed. Here's what we have. And they, his disciples that heard it, were exceedingly astonished out of measure. I think you just repeated astonished out of measure by saying exceedingly. And amazed, saying. And they, his disciples that heard it, saying, would almost have to have said, right? And they, his disciples that heard it, were such and such, and said, Oh, what about this among themselves now? Said among themselves. Said among themselves. Okay, what did they say? Okay, that's the same in all. Who then can who then can be saved? Okay, here's what we have. And they, his disciples that heard it, were exceedingly astonished out of measure and amazed, said among themselves, who then can be saved? What about, that's pretty choppy. That's pretty Tatianic there, I guess. Seems like I'm saying some words that we missed in there, though. Of course, we can't have said and sang. This time we took said. That's only in Luke. The majority is saying. Matthew and Mark have sang. That all depends on sentence structure, whether you end up with saying, whether you end up with said. What about the first word in Matthew 19:25? When? We didn't have that word in there. And they, his disciples, and when they, his disciples, that had heard it, and when they, his disciples that heard it, were exceedingly, that needs to go somewhere else, were astonished out of measure and exceedingly amazed, so we keep those two words together. Exceedingly amazed, said, or we could say said and were saying, so we get saying in there. Said and were saying among themselves, who then can be saved? Well, we just do that to show you what a problem Tatian has on his hands here. Now you see how it takes us, what? We wasted 10, 15 minutes there, and we failed on 2 verses, getting it all out of order and forgetting some words, and it took a number of brains put together in here to get all of that down. Of course, you think, well, if I were by myself, I could work better. Well, sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not. Here is what is suggested as to how Tatian went about composing this, and there is one problem with it I'll point out in a moment, but here's what's been suggested. Probably he had 4 individual gospel manuscripts before him. You can't have it all bound in a codex. Of course, we're a little earlier than the time of the codices in Tatian's time, the latter half of the 2nd century A.D. anyway. So he's probably got something like scrolls, but of course that'll be hard. You have to have some rocks or sticks around with you to hold the paper open so it doesn't fly together. You got to have all 4 of those held open. And then you're looking over there in Matthew and in Mark and in John and in Luke. And as he would read the story of Christ, then he wove this narrative together in his Diatessaron, which would be extremely, extremely difficult to do. Some people, I don't think, appreciate Tatian's work or anybody's work whenever they try to harmonize the Gospels in an extreme narrative fashion, which is what he's trying to do here. So as he would read this story, I mean, we could take something that we're already a little familiar with here, like the Sermon on the Mount. We'd go over there in Matthew's account and Luke's account and try to weave those together, find out now where are they just duplicating one another, and so we just will mark that out. But where has one omitted something that the other retains, and we'll have to be sure to include that. And it's been suggested that he marked out the material, crossed it out, as he finished it in his exemplars. Almost, it doesn't seem like there's any way we can get around that he must have marked his material out. Can you imagine looking at those manuscripts and trying to keep your 4 hands, you only have 2, but your 4 hands in all 4 places. You know how you keep your finger on a page whenever you look up to make sure you look right back down at that place? And all 4 manuscripts as you're reading along there. Now I said we'd have a little problem. The little problem would be the value of ancient manuscripts. If you're just going to cross all of these words out, you've destroyed those manuscripts then. Would Tatian really have done something like that? Have used 4 exemplar manuscripts only for composing his Diatessaron? Whenever he gets through with a certain portion of a chapter or of a story, then he starts marking it out. Of course, perhaps he starts right at the very beginning and marks out every single word as he goes along. Otherwise, if we don't opt for that, it's a little difficult to see how he could have avoided this massive confusion. And one thing that we find in the manuscripts that have preserved the Diatessaron, the Armenian, the Arabic, and so forth, we don't have a lot of confusion. Not as far as duplication is concerned, neither as far as omission is concerned. Those would be the two chief areas one would fall into rather quickly whenever you're trying to do something like this. You'd be duplicating or you'd be omitting material. So I guess that suggestion, of course we won't ever know unless you ask Tatian or something exactly what he did. I guess that suggestion will probably stand and hold up for at least a period of time until someone can prove otherwise. Probably he had 4 separate gospel manuscripts before him. As he read the story of the gospel, he wove the narrative together in his Diatessaron, possibly crossing out material as he finished it in his exemplar. We're going to suggest that as far as his composition is concerned. Where did he begin? Where would you begin? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Flip to all 4 Gospels and take a look at the first couple of verses there, and let's see how we would begin this then. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all start at different points. 4 different points beginning. I think I've said something like this before. Maybe I can just kind of say it in a technical setting here of looking at Tatian's Diatessaron, because it concerns itself only with the Gospels and not other biblical material. The Gospels are the most important books in the Bible. They're the most richly rewarding as far as in-depth study is concerned, because we have 4 different presentations many times. If we don't have that, it's either 3 or 2. Rarely do we only have 1. If we have 1, it's generally Johannine and not synoptic. We have as many as 4 different presentations of the same story, of the same life, the birth, the life, the ministry, the death, the resurrection, the ascension of Christ. I mean, we only have 1 book of Revelation. We only have 1 epistle to the Hebrews. We only have 1 New Testament ethical Proverbs, book of James. We only have 1 of those. We only have 1 profound theological work, the book of Romans. We only have 1 now concerning book that just deals with almost every question in the church under the sun, 1 Corinthians. We have 4 Gospels. It's unique, of course, in all of the biblical books. So a lot of research has gone into the synoptic question. A lot of research has gone into the origins of the Gospels, and a lot of research still needs to go into the Gospels because we're dealing with such crucially important material. Okay, we have over in Matthew, I don't have all this down, but most of us are familiar enough with the beginning of the Gospels. We know how they start off. We've got a little introductory sentence there in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1 that's going to take us back through David, back to the time of Abraham. Over in Mark, we're just going to have the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Mark 1 and verse 1. This is the beginning of the gospel. In Luke, we're going to have a little 4-verse prologue, writing unto, oh, dear Theophilus. Unto John, in John, we're going to have a little 18 or so verse prologue, the Logos section of John. It's the only time he deals with Logos there in his gospel. It's found right there in the first 18 or so verses, I believe. Generally thought of as the introduction to John's gospel. So one goes to David, to Abraham. One just says this is the beginning of the gospel story. Luke gives us a little prologue about his research and the books that have come before him and how he's gotten his material, although he's not an eyewitness, from eyewitnesses, those who are eyewitnesses and ministers of the gospel. And John just says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So if you're going to start a gospel narrative harmony, what's your first sentence then? Be a long one. Like about 47 pages. Someone said John, someone said Luke. No one, John, Luke. No one wants Matthew. No one wants Mark. Mark's way too brief for us. He only has like a 13-verse introduction there, and then he just blows right into Jesus' ministry. We know that, of course, Matthew and Luke are dealing with the nativity, birth, childhood, boyhood accounts. And John, well, he's way out in left field with his deep theological thinking and application of everything. Someone loves John. Well, I don't know if Mark or Luke or Matthew will take that kindly, but we'll pass over it anyway. Okay, first sentence then. We're going to have to go over to Luke or over to John for the first sentence. Luke. Because you see, Luke's not even dealing with the story yet. 4 verses of just the introductory prologue here. Well, I'm not going to write all that out, but I'll write Luke 1, verses 1 through 4. So what's Luke 1:5? There was in the days of Herod. Well, we certainly don't want that. That's way too late in history to start there. So what? I guess we go over to John then? In the beginning was the Word. Well, how far do we go in John before we end our use in John, though?
Verse 3. John the Baptist.
All the way up to John the Baptist? Some of you are saying yes. Verse 3. Verse 5. 1 through 5. Okay, that's majority. So Luke gave us our prologue, and then John gave us our in the beginning. The light shineth in darkness, the darkness comprehended, probably a bad translation, the darkness could not overcome it. But that ends with verse 5, then where do we go? Now the next verse in John is, there was a man sent from God whose name was John, not John the gospel writer, but John Baptist. There's John Baptist. Luke starts with Herod. Herod's earlier than John Baptist. Mark just says this is the beginning of the gospel, so we really don't even want to use Mark's gospel. Go to Matthew. Stick the genealogy in there. Well, what about Luke's? We don't get to his until over in chapter 3. So then we have to skip all the way over to chapter 3 and throw Luke's genealogy in there. And what about whenever they don't parallel one another? That'd be pretty difficult to work out those genealogies. By the way, is Matthew's genealogy 14, 14, 14? Is that complete there? No, no way. We studied that in creation. That's typical of writing down genealogies. He puts it in a little threefold segment just for sake of memorization, 14, 14, 14. But we got names omitted. We've got names duplicated there. So Matthew wasn't doing too good of a job of harmonizing the Old Testament chronologies. Made the mistakes, of course, not mistakes, but of duplication and omission. Well, it feels like to me we're kind of stuck. I'm still stuck with John 1 and verse 5. We're saying go to the genealogies, but if we go to Matthew 1:1, that's kind of a summary of Matthew's genealogy. It doesn't get into the genealogies. Then we have to go to Luke. I'll just put down genealogies, and where do we go after that? How far do we go there in Matthew chapter 1? Verse 17. And what? We got to deal with Luke's genealogy too? That would be way over in Luke 3, verses 23 through 38. All right. Okay, now let's go back to Matthew 1. We would leave off with verse 18. The birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. Well, John came before him, so I guess we'd skip Matthew now. Where do we go? Back to John 1:6 or over there to Luke 1:5? Luke 1:5. Okay, how far do we go in Luke before we drop Luke again? Oh, how about Mark 1:2? Mark 1:2 is going to give us a prophecy, some of the prophets that are predicting John's ministry. Then we still got to deal with the first verse of Mark. Where does that fit in? Or we just throw that out? I mean, obviously it's an introductory verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. After the genealogies. Okay, I guess that would fit. So we've got Mark 1:1. Then we go to Luke 1:5. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah. And I guess we'd have to get this whole story, which would go down I guess to verse 25. Then where do we go after that? You see how confusing this can become. Back to Mark. Where we get 1, 2, and 3. All the way down to 11. Well, if we go through 11, that gets us up into the baptism of Christ. We still have to deal with those verses in John 1:6 on. Well, let's just stop right there. It's a mess. So we fail. We fail on trying to make our own harmony here. It's very difficult to do something like that. It helps you better appreciate what Tatian was trying to do, though. That's why it's better to leave them in a synopsis form. You just copy the Gospels down and put them in columns one beside another. Different manuscript traditions have him beginning with different portions of the Gospel story. The Arabic and Persian copies have him beginning with Mark 1:1. The Arabic and Persian manuscripts have Tatian beginning with Mark 1:1. The Latin version, Codex Fuldensis, has him beginning with Luke 1:1. But Ephraim's commentary, which is the more reliable of them all, and many other manuscripts, different translations and other statements in church writings, have him beginning with what is generally accepted as the start of Tatian's Diatessaron, and that is John 1:1. So for those of you who said John 1:1, you win as far as Tatian is concerned. It appears as though he began with John 1:1 and worked from that point. How do we explain Arabic, Persian, Codex Fuldensis? They just represent later corruptions. And there are some ways. I've got the material at home, but I didn't bring it because it's way too technical to explain what happened in some of these other translations, why they end up in later copies of them, beginning with either Mark 1:1 or Luke 1:1 and not John 1:1. But I won't bother you with that material. So there's what we're saying concerning Tatian's composition of the Diatessaron. Very tedious, meticulous work. Requires quite a lot of exceptional skills, just skills in the organization of one's mind, to be able to have all of this down. Secondly, I said we wanted to look at sources. Sources. What did Tatian use? It's obvious that his manuscripts of the canonical Gospels must have been Orthodox copies. They must have been Orthodox because we don't have some of the later erroneous and heretical corruptions that are seen in others, such as the Muratorian canon and so forth. But did he use anything else besides Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? Did he take any heretical liberties with the Orthodox manuscripts that he had before him? How much of a heretic was Tatian, I guess we have to discuss here. When did his proclivity toward heresy start in his life? Well, most people feel that he had ascetic Encretite tendencies. Remember, he was one of the founders of some ascetic Encretite groups in Syria. Most feel that he had ascetic Encretite tendencies probably from the day of his conversion, and that they became more developed as he grew older. I don't personally ever cease to be amazed over the recurring problem of asceticism in the church. We've had it here in our church. When I say our church, I don't just mean to put the blame on someone else. I mean right in the teaching. We have had problems of asceticism, extreme forms of separation from the world, extreme ideas about holiness, and I mean extreme in the erroneous sense of the term. Seems like it's just a never-ending problem the church has to face. How can you be pure, holy, morally upright, devoted, dedicated unto the Lord, and separated from the world, but as Jesus said in John 17, still be in the world? I pray that you not take them out of the world, but keep them from the evil one who is in the world. Seems to be almost a never-ending problem, and it's almost like something that continually you have to come back to and rebalance the whole situation. You can't just say, okay, here's the answer. Here's the answer to asceticism. Here's the answer to identifying with this world and this world's ways, and this will forever clear things up. Because as soon as you go along a day or two or a week or a month, you think about your own life. What happens? You go off one area or the other. You try to become too holy, and I mean too holy in the wrong sense of the term, or you end up with ascetic tendencies, going off in wrong areas there, or of course you conform yourself to the world. Seems like he probably began in his Christian life. I guess maybe we all do in some measure or some fashion. Whenever you get converted, you think, I've got to separate myself from this world. And so you change your clothing, maybe put on white garb or maybe earth brown, yellow shirts to identify with the sun and with the earth movement. Or maybe you go from hippie clothing to three-piece suits or three-piece suits to hippie clothing. You just go one direction or another. That's supposed to prove that now you're holy. Now you're different, you know. Prophet said, change your heart, not your garment. We get our hearts changed and think we have to change our garments. And so we change our garments then. Well, it seems like he started off as a heretic, and he ended up as a heretic, but his heresy was more developed as he went along. Let's look at some passages where we can definitely see, basically through Ephraim's Syriac commentary, the heretical, ascetic, encretite tendencies of Tatian. While we're looking at sources, we're saying that he used orthodox copies of the canonical Gospels. But in the areas where he had erroneous doctrine, then he took heretical liberties with the text. For instance, let's begin with Matthew chapter 1 and verse 19. By the way, do you remember from the last study, do you remember what some of his ascetic beliefs were? What was he opposed to? Marriage, meats, and wine. He was opposed to marriage, meats, and wine. So it only goes to reason that when we have a passage like that in the Gospels, we're just dealing with the Gospels, of course, then he might alter a thing or two here. Matthew 1:19. He avoids here calling Joseph Mary's husband. And, of course, every other passage that we have connections with through Ephraim's commentary or other writings. But here's one that I just picked out of many in particular. Matthew 1:19, he avoids calling Joseph Mary's husband. Now that could be explained one of two ways. We believe it's the way we're talking about. Because of his already embedded ascetic encretite tendencies, he would have taken heretical or erroneous liberties with the text here. Of course, secondly, it could be explained by virtue of the fact that Tatian was unknowledgeable concerning Jewish marriage contracts. And if he was unknowledgeable of that, then of course, obviously, one would hesitate calling Joseph the husband of Mary when they're not married yet. But since he's living only a couple of centuries after that time, it'd be a little difficult to say that he's totally unfamiliar with marriage contracts. If you don't know what I mean by that, I'm sure we'll get to that in ethics. Then over in Luke chapter 2 and verse 36. There was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phamuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was of great age, and had lived with an husband 7 years from her virginity. And then she was a widow 84. In other words, what's that saying? It's kind of strange arrangement of words, but she had been married 4 years, or 7 years rather. She had been married 7 years. He changes it to 7 days. It's interesting he doesn't change the term husband. He leaves husband there, but 7 years, that's too long to be married. We'll change it to 7 days. He changed the 7 years to 7 days. Then her husband died, and she lived without him 84 years. Genesis 2:24. Genesis 2:24. As it's quoted over in Matthew 19:5. Tatian transfers this statement from God's mouth to Adam's mouth. And I wasn't following Tatian, but I think I did the same thing back in Old Testament introduction. And if I never have corrected that, I guess now is the time to correct it. That's why I gave you Genesis to begin with, although he, of course, was dealing just with the Gospels. We'll look at this in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. Adam said, we're reading verse 23 now, Genesis 2:24. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." And so I was just assuming Adam said, verse 23, that we go on with Adam said, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Genesis 2:24. And then, of course, we'd know verse 25 would be the comment of the sacred historian Moses. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So the historian fills in verse 25. Adam says verse 23. Who says verse 24? Probably God, not Adam. Adam has no concept of fathers or mothers because he's never had one. So he has no concept of fathers or mothers. He has no concept of marriage. He's never been married before. He has no concept of this one flesh business. It's just taking place right here in this context. So I think it's best to assume, and I correct myself from earlier statements, that God is the one who said this, not Adam. Of course, I don't think it's a big thing one way or the other, but I do remember saying that on an occasion. So with that in mind, if you'll turn over to Matthew 19 and verse 5. Here, by implication, God is the one who said Genesis 2:24 and not Adam. Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, What have we studied recently that would have to do with Matthew 19:3? I know, we're studying so much. Hillel and Shammai, the two Jewish rabbis, remember? Hillel was the more liberal of the two, and it seems like they're asking the question from his point of view, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Shammai was much more conservative. They only allowed a few causes, a few reasons for divorce. They're trying, in other words, to get him to side with the disciples of Shammai or the disciples of Hillel. And so he doesn't side with either one. He sides just with Moses and God from Genesis. And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he, okay, who's this he which made them at the beginning? God. That he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, the pronoun he is understood here, and he said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So you see what we're doing there. It seems like the implication, because of the pronoun he in verse 4, would be to add that to and said in the beginning of verse 5, putting this in the mouth of God and not the mouth of Adam. Now what Tatian does is he puts it in the mouth of Adam. Now why would he do that? Because then you don't have God's approval on marriage. You see, if you've got Genesis 2:24 coming from God's mouth, a man shall leave his mother, or his mother and his father, and cleave unto his wife, and these two shall be one flesh. You have God's original approval of a monogamous relationship. However, if you take it from God's mouth and put it in Adam's, maybe Adam was wrong. So see, very subtly he deals with this. And of course he puts Adam's name here then in verse 5 instead of just and set. So that deals some with marriage. Let's go over to John 15. I don't think I do have one down. It's not specifically about meat. I have basically some divers examples that speak to marriage and wine. What would you think of in John 15 that might have to be dealt with? John 15. I am the true vine. What's a vine? Produces grapes, which produce wine. He changed that to, I am the tree of the fruit of truth. I mean, because this would really be bad. Jesus said, I am the source of alcoholic beverages. I am the true vine. He changed it to read, I am the tree of the fruit of truth. Very interesting man. In John 2:10, he doesn't deal with the whole. We might think he would just take all of this drunken marriage feast at Cana of Galilee, just take that out, first 11 verses of John. He doesn't. I'm looking for the phrase that he takes out. He takes out the middle of verse 10, and when men have well drunk. He takes that phrase out. Leaves the rest of it there, but he erases that, or with his scissors cuts that right out of the text. John 2:10 right in the middle, and when men have well drunk. Another example I have down, Matthew 11 and verse 19. He takes the whole part of the verse out. You'll see what we're talking about here. Matthew 11:19. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, Behold, a man gluttonous and a wine-bibber, a friend of publicans and sinners, but wisdom is justified of her children. So that whole verse is erased out of Tatian's harmony. Jesus was a gluttonous, wine-bibbing friend of sinners. So he takes that out. And one other passage, Matthew 27. This is just representative, just to show you how he's using the Orthodox manuscripts he has before him. Matthew 27:34. We happen to have several readings on this, and the KJV takes the wrong reading here. They do exactly what Tatian did. Here he changed it from wine and gall to vinegar and gall. So you get the wine out and you have vinegar and gall. The KJV follows a variant reading that also has vinegar. And they gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall. But it should read, they gave him wine to drink mingled with gall. So maybe they were reading Tatian's Diatessaron whenever they translated this verse, because that's very, very similar to Tatian's Diatessaron. A change from wine, in short, it's a change from wine to vinegar. And we have that in that way here in KJV, and it needs to go from vinegar back to wine. Now, it's often said that he used all four Gospels, but in using the four Gospels, he majored on John and Matthew. He majored on John and Matthew, plus the Gospel according to the Hebrews. We're talking about his sources. He used Orthodox copies of the four canonical Gospels. Did he use anything else? Many scholars, it's just popularly said, many scholars feel that he made extensive use of the Gospel according to the Hebrews, one of the New Testament pseudepigraphal books that we discussed. Well, it may be true that he used the Gospel according to the Hebrews, but it is not nearly as extensive as too many, even conservative scholars, make it out to be. Metzger is in total disagreement with some statistics he gives from another scholar, and I tend to agree with this. If he used the Gospel according to the Hebrews, and it does appear that he did, he made use only in very small portions. For instance, one portion where he might have gotten something from the Gospel according to the Hebrews concerns the baptism episode of Jesus. The canonical Gospels tell us that when he was baptized, two things happened. One, the heavens opened and the Holy Spirit descended, as it were, in the form of a dove. And secondly, that the Father's voice came from heaven. This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. The Diatessaron adds a third thing at this experience of Christ, and that is a great light or fire that fell from heaven. Justin mentions this in his writings, that he had come across this. Justin is just 2nd century A.D. And Epiphanius said that it was in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Now, we don't know, since we don't have that extant in the Gospel according to the Hebrews, but Epiphanius, E-P-I-P-H-A-N-I-U-S, Epiphanius said that it was. In his writings, which are extant, this portion of them, he said that it was in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So we're not for certain on that. It's also said that Tatian had a strong Judaistic bent to him and used some Jewish source material. But that pretty much has been totally disproven. So summing this up, what we're saying is he definitely used the four canonical Gospels. Some people say, Some scholars write that he used some other Jewish sources that really were strongly teaching Judaism. That does not appear to be true. Others say he made extensive use of the gospel according to the Hebrews. That does not appear to be true, not in the extensive sense. Only in relatively small portions did he use that. What about the business of majoring on John and Matthew? Well, I don't think that can even be proven. But let me explain something about John and Matthew. John, of course, is a gospel all unto itself. It's very dissimilar to the so-called synoptics, those who see through the same eye, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you're going to have to use a lot of John if you're trying to get the whole gospel story together, because I don't have any percentages with me right now, but I don't know, 3/4 of John's gospel is not found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Therefore, if you want the whole gospel story, I guess we could say, in one sense of the term, you're going to have to major in John because there's so much material in John not found in others. I don't think that necessarily proves, though, that he has any strong bias toward John as a writer, toward John's gospel. As far as using Matthew, well, probably using something like Mark or even Luke, but particularly Mark would be a better guess if we're going to say he's majoring on one or the other. I don't really think he's majoring on any of them. I think he's taking all four of them together as he reads this whole story of Christ, and he weaves this narrative account together in his Diatessaron. So sources, primarily Orthodox manuscripts of the canonical Gospels, maybe a little bit from the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So in other words, we're saying that his heretical tendencies aren't seen in the non-canonical source material that he relies upon, but it's seen rather in his heretical liberties he takes with the Orthodox copies of manuscripts he has before him in these passages we have enumerated. Finally, this evening, that brings us to the subject of the significance of the Diatessaron. The significance of Tatian's Diatessaron. In several areas. First of all, I think it's interesting to see how early Christians began making attempts to harmonize the gospel facts. That's rather significant in itself. We know that it's popular in Christian circles today. We know that it's been popular down through the centuries of Christianity. So Tatian's Diatessaron is significant in that it takes us back to our earliest definite, by definite I mean with manuscript evidence, existence of an attempt to harmonize the gospel story. The date of the fragment of Dura on the Euphrates tends to prove how important this is, since it only is 86 to maybe 100 years after the autograph of Tatian's Diatessaron. There's one area where we see the significance of the Diatessaron. Secondly, the significance lies primarily in the area of dating the gospel autographs. Here's what you'll need to listen to carefully because it could get a little complicated. The significance of the Diatessaron lies primarily in the area of dating the gospel autographs. Now, get down what you can. I'll tell you a little story about critical scholarship of last century and what Tatian's Diatessaron, as well as some other discoveries, have done to go a long way in sinking the battleship of critical theory and thought. It was a bygone, foregone conclusion last century by too much of critical scholarship that the Gospels, the four canonical received in the church Gospels, were written from the mid to the late 2nd century A.D. That was just a foregone conclusion. Case sealed, signed, delivered, over with, not open to debate anymore. Conservatives all through the centuries are wrong. They've been proven to be wrong by liberal critical scholarship because the Gospels, the autographs, date only back to the mid to the late 2nd century A.D. In other words, from 150 to 199 A.D. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote their Gospels. Of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't write them. Some spurious pseudonymous writer came along and wrote them, taking the name of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and penning a gospel as a result of that. However, recent discoveries have tended to do nothing but establish, validate, confirm conservative estimates all along. Conservative estimates put all of the Gospels in the first century. The fragment of John's Gospel, John chapter 18, I believe, that we discussed back when we looked at the Greek manuscripts and the Greek papyri, John Ryland's Papyrus 457. He has a 458 that I think is part of Deuteronomy, but John Ryland's Papyrus 457, which in the enumeration of the papyri is known as P52, dates from 125, if you remember that little fragment we've shown pictures of before, the earliest extant portion of the New Testament. 125. In other words, how could John have written his gospel somewhere between 150 and 199? Since we have a little scrap that fairly reliably can be dated back to 25 to 75 or 74 years prior to that time. So that's, of course, one discovery that seems to confirm the estimates of conservatives and deny the validity of critical scholarship's conclusions. And then, of course, secondly, what we're talking about is the Diatessaron. Now we have the discovery of this little 4-inch by 4-inch fragment at Dura on the Euphrates, which puts us back, of course, into the mid-3rd century, but evidently too close to when they're saying the Gospels were originally composed. Many critical scholars had admitted all along the existence of Tatian, but they denied vehemently the historicity of any such thing as his Diatessaron. That's why last week I gave you all the manuscript evidence we have for the Diatessaron. Because after all, we don't have the Diatessaron around anymore. And so critical scholarship said, yes, a man by the name of Tatian lived at one time, but as far as the Diatessaron, you say it existed? Where is it then? Where is it? Where's the proof of it at all? Show us even a translation of a translation of a translation of it. And not until just last century do we find this beginning to take place. Remember that an Arminian publication was printed in 1836. Well, you'd think that would do something to critical scholarship. Well, our point last time is the same as this evening. Most scholars couldn't read the Arminian language. Therefore, an Arminian publication of an Arminian text that dates back to the end of the 11th century, or the 12th century rather, AD of Tatian's Diatessaron doesn't do anything at all. The Latin version was published 40 years later in 1876. And that was more important because Western scholarship was familiar with the Latin tongue, but it went unnoticed for about 4 years. First book that really includes it is a book that was published in 1880. That is, it has any recognition of knowledge of the existence of a Latin publication of Tatian's Diatessaron. Meanwhile, while all this is going on here, a very learned book was anonymously published in 1874, 2 years prior to the Latin publication of one of these two Arminian texts, or really a combination of them is what took place. A learned book was anonymously published in 1874 entitled Supernatural Religion, an inquiry into the reality of divine revelation. Supernatural Religion, an inquiry into the reality of divine revelation. Later, the author was said to be Walter Richard Cassels, and that seems to be true. W.R. Cassels, Cassels. He published it initially anonymously. What was this book all about? Well, here he set forth arguments for disbelieving Eusebius and all the other church writers we've talked about who spoke of the Diatessaron. He set forth a whole slew of arguments for disbelieving, in other words, the historicity, not of Tatian. They believe that Tatian really existed, but of his Diatessaron. Why did he do that? Why did he do that? Well, remember, since we have the dates for Tatian, he evidently died around 172, and critical scholarship has not had any problems with that at all. That would mean that he would have to have a harmony of the Gospels by that date. We're saying around 170. If the Gospels weren't in their autographs penned until somewhere between 150 and 199, that's too close, extremely close. That is way too close to have the Gospels really being written then with Tatian's Diatessaron coming at the same time. Therefore, the reason that he brings forth all these arguments is that if he, as well as critical scholarship in general, if he accepts, or he accepted then, the historicity of the Diatessaron, and that would date it back to 170, then he's going to have to reevaluate and change all of his dates for the autographs of the Gospels. Even the great scholar J.B. Lightfoot, this is a humorous note I guess we'll end on here this evening, he could only argue against Cassell's book from what we can call probability. He gave an elaborate reply in the Contemporary Review, 1877. However, as Sir Frederick Kenyon has said, the whole time the evidence, as it were, existed right under their nose. What do we mean by that? The whole time J.B. Lightfoot had in his own library a personal copy of the Mechitarist edition of Ephraim's commentary on the Diatessaron. But alas, it was in Armenian. That was a problem. Just a year before, you see, it's really too early for him to have a copy of the Latin, published in 1876, but he has a copy of the Armenian, published in 1836, right in his own library. He has a personal copy of the Mechitarist from Venice edition of Ephraim's commentary. They didn't have the Syriac, and that just came out in 1957. Then I have a quote of his 12 years later, in 1889, in a little work entitled Essays on Supernatural Religion. Some responses to Cassell's publication, Supernatural Religion. Lightfoot said the following, and I quote from 1889. I had for some years possessed a copy of this work in 4 volumes, and the thought had more than once crossed my mind that possibly it might throw light on Ephraim's mode of dealing with the Gospels, as I knew that it contained notes on Paul's epistles or some portions of them. I did not, however, then possess sufficient knowledge of Armenian to sift its contents, but I hoped to investigate the matter when I had mastered enough of the language.